Welcome to Case by Case. We want to just take a moment and remind you that this content is intended for adult audiences. It is created for educational and informational purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as discussions may include references to real criminal cases, violence, and other sensitive and potentially distressing topics. While we strive to present every case with accuracy and respect those involved, the material may not be suitable for all viewers. Please proceed thoughtfully. And remember, if you need to take a step back, if you find something that concerns you, if you find it to be triggering and you need to take a step back, please do. You can join us whenever you're ready to come back. We'll leave the light on. Today, we're diving into one of the most chilling and honestly bizarre serial killer partnerships in the United States history. A case that terrified Los Angeles in the 1970s, baffled investigators, and introduced the world to two cousins whose relationship was toxic from the moment they teamed up. Those cousins were Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, infamously remembered as the Hillside Stranglers. You'll notice something different about this case compared to many other serial killings, because most serial killers act alone. They plan alone and they hunt alone. They isolate themselves from anyone who could disrupt their fantasies. But this case is the exact opposite. These two men, grown cousins, adult cousins, fed off of each other's worst impulses. And because of that dynamic, because of that power imbalance, and because of their need to outdo one another, the violence escalated quickly and terrifyingly. Their victims were left poised on hillsides in Los Angeles, which led to the nickname that would stick forever. So, we're going to walk through who these two men were before they met up, how their partnership formed, how they carried out their crimes, the method and the staging that they did when they posed their victims, what ultimately led to their arrest, and what happened to each of them afterward. Now, we're not going to, since I can't speak today, we're not going to sensationalize the horror of this whole situation. But I wanted to highlight this case to help you understand how two individuals ended up feeding into the darkest parts of each other and how the case finally broke open. This is Case by Case, and this is the story of the Hillside Stranglers. I'm going to start off talking about each one of these guys. The youngest of the two cousins was Kenneth Bianchi. He was charming on the surface, but he was so manipulative. He had a long history of lying, drifting from job to job, and pretending to be someone he wasn't. He often faked illnesses, he lied about his education, and he constantly sought control, especially through deceit. He had twisted fantasies of becoming a police officer, not because he wanted to protect people, but because he really wanted the power, the badge, the authority, the control. And that desire becomes very important later. So he moved from New York to Los Angeles and he began spending time with his older cousin, Angelo. And Angelo is the man who would become the dominant partner to this killing partnership that they had. Now, Angelo was very different. He was older, more dominant, and openly cruel. He did not try to be a charmer. He styled himself as a tough guy. He wanted people to see him as someone with control, and he wanted control over everyone around him, especially women. He ran a small upholstery shop, but his real interest was power and intimidation. So Angelo saw people as tools. He used women. He believed that he was untouchable. And when Bianchi arrived in LA, Buono saw him. I don't know if it's Buono or Bono. I'm going to say Bono because I think that's how I've heard it pronounced in the things I've been listening to, but it's different with different people. Buono saw him as someone he could mold, someone he could dominate, and Bianchi was really eager to be accepted. And that's how this deadly partnership formed. One man desperate for validation, and the other one was eager to control someone. Now, let's talk about how they became the Hillside Stranglers. The crimes began as a twisted escalation of a dynamic between them. They started experimenting with ways to lure women using what became their most disturbing tactic. They posed as police officers. This was especially effective because Bianchi had been trying to get hired as a police officer, and he knew the language. He knew how officers spoke, and he understood the psychology of compliance. And Bianchi was, again, he was a charmer. He would smile and just turn nice and helpful in just a moment. And so people really didn't know what they were getting with him. Now, they both used fake badges, they used fake authority and fake accusations to get victims into their car. And once the women were in their custody, the cousins felt completely in control, and the women never stood a chance. I won't go into a lot of graphic detail, but here's the pattern that investigators eventually pieced together. The victims were approached under the pretense of a police investigation. They were taken to Buono's home. This was the safe zone where no one questioned anything. Now remember, he had his own automotive upholstery business, so he didn't have to worry about punching a clock or going in at any specific time. So there weren't a lot of people to question what he was doing and when he was doing it, because he was basically on his own time. So he was able to take them to his home where there just wasn't a lot of, there wasn't anybody overlooking anything. The cousins used restraints, intimidation, and a level of domination completely fueled by power and control. And, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I do want to talk about this. They really did feed off of one another. So they might take a young woman home, for example, and they would lure her to the house. And once they got her to his house, they would take turns not only sexually abusing her, but physically abusing her in other ways, choking her until she passed out, and then bringing her back around, going through these sexual fantasies they each had, and doing this to this woman over and over and over. And then eventually they would decide it was time for her to go, and they would brutally murder her. And then they would throw her out on the side of the road, but they would pose her in a way that she would be seen, because even though they didn't want to be caught, they wanted to know that they had done something and that other people could see them. The victims were ultimately killed through strangulation because, like I said, that was part of their whole thing. The cousins would then transport and position them on hillsides or in areas where they would be found. And the posing wasn't accidental. It served a psychological purpose because it showed a control even after death, the need to shock the public, and that was really important for Bianchi. It was a message, not consciously stated, but implied, that they were in charge and they could do anything they want with these women, no matter whether they were alive or dead. The bodies found on hillsides created a media storm. Investigators publicly began referring to them as the Hillside Strangler because they were believing they were hunting one man. And the cousins really fed off of this. back in this time, there wasn't a knowledge from investigators of teams of serial killers acting together in concert, and it was sort of an anomaly. You did have Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, but they were doing things on their own as well. And there wasn't as much information on what they actually did together because neither one of them were truthful. I mean, some serial killers are more truthful than others. But these two really did not appear to be more than one person. LA law enforcement was really overwhelmed, and multiple agencies were involved. LAPD, LA County Sheriff, Glendale PD, and Burbank PD. Coordination was a nightmare in the late 70s, as we talked about in the Bundy case. Information wasn't centralized, and the victims came from different jurisdictions. Now, I want you to just think about the 70s and this, what they call the golden age of serial killers. Police had not been, they weren't used to this level of depravity, I guess I can say. It was really shocking. And imagine being an officer back in this time, a detective, and you've got bodies everywhere. You've got several serial killers going on in the 70s in, LA. You've got the Manson people in August of 69. That's all in California. Then you've got, these Hillside Stranglers in LA in the early 70s. All up the West Coast, you've got Bundy going on. You've got there were some other serial killers in that area that I can't think of the name off at the top of my head, but I know that there were several. Well, you had Kemper. So you had several of those at that same time. So investigators must have been thinking, what is in the water? Where did this all come from, and why all of a sudden? Well, it probably had been going on before, but there were a lot of things changing in our world that made us more aware that it was going on. And investigators began to get better and better at tying these things together and seeing that this wasn't a one-off. This was the same killer, but he was just moving to a different location. This was before they tied all of the truck driving things together and realized that a lot of things were happening across country because people were on the road all the time, and it made it convenient. But the investigators started to notice patterns, similar methods, similar posing, similar ligature marks, and a real escalation. Now, this wasn't really like Bundy's because these were posed in obvious locations, so they were found almost immediately. Number one. Number two, they had the same form of, the same method with strangulation. And this was happening in one area over a period of time. So it was perplexing, but it was one of those that was readily acknowledged to be multiple murders that are connected. But this case was one of the biggest serial investigations in Los Angeles history at this point. They didn't have DNA. They didn't have sophisticated. I apologize. I don't know what's wrong with me. I cannot talk today. They didn't have DNA. They didn't have sophisticated forensic databases, and everything was footwork. They had to go interview everyone. They had to look at the timelines and the patterns and imagine the time that it took to talk to, everybody that drove by that maybe saw the bodies and try to track that back to the time that the bodies were actually placed there, and then try to find people that potentially were in the area and saw someone with a vehicle around that time. A lot of that same kind of investigation, those techniques took place in the Atlanta child murders too, because you didn't know when the bodies were placed in their areas. So you didn't have really a timeline of exactly when they died. So you had to really look closely at the crime scene and let that tell you a lot and work backwards. And that's what these investigators were doing. Everything was just, old-fashioned footwork. What ultimately broke the case open wasn't surveillance, it wasn't forensics, and it wasn't a witness. It was one of them who couldn't keep their mouth shut. It was Bianchi's own mouth and his inability to stay out of trouble. After the murders, Bianchi moved to Washington State, and guess what he did? He decided to continue the pattern, but he thought he was good enough to do this all on his own. He attempted another abduction and murder, but this time he made mistakes because remember, his older cousin was the one that had the ability to plan all this, put it all together, and make sure that everything was followed. So he made mistakes, and Washington State investigators picked up on inconsistencies and they linked it back to the LA murders. Again, remember, Washington State had a lot of things going on during this time. And once Bianchi was arrested, everything unraveled. Well, this is where it gets a little bit interesting here. In the 70s, there was a lot of talk about new things in psychology and the way psychology was changing. And one of the things that came out during that time was this thought of multiple personalities. And it was all over the place. There were a lot of books written about it. There was Sybil and Billy Mulligan. I think it's Billy Mulligan. There were several books that were put into movie form. So this was a big thing. And, we've come a long way understanding that sort of break in the psyche. But back in the 70s, it was sort of looked at as, this person would almost turn into another person when they were sitting there. And I'll be honest, I've never met anyone that had multiple personalities, so I don't really know what to observe. Now, I've met a few people that I thought missed a good opportunity because they certainly did seem crazy, but I don't mean in the way that forensically and psychologically what I'm about to discuss. Bianchi was following up on all of this stuff hitting the news and the media. So he went to great lengths to stage going in and out of personalities and alter egos. And then he specifically said that there was a Steve Walker, and he insisted that Steve committed the murders. Well, psychologists were brought in because this really was a big thing, but they saw right through him. They knew he was faking it because even in the 70s, when this was such a phenomenon, psychologists knew what to look for. Well, once his psychological defense collapsed, what do you think his choice was? His last defense was to turn state's evidence against his cousin. And he did it to save himself from the death penalty. But even then, things were rocky because Bianchi was such a compulsive liar that prosecutors struggled to use him. Nobody believed him. Nobody believed, what was going on. But his eventual cooperation provided enough inside detail to help secure his cousin's conviction as well. So here's what happened to him. Buono went to trial first. Prosecutors painted him as a mastermind, and he really was. The dominant personality, he was the controlling figure, and he was the guy who guided and encouraged the violence. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he died in prison in 2002 of a heart attack. Now, Bianchi, who cooperated, did avoid the death penalty, but he did get life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he's still in jail, in prison in Washington State to this day. He's attempted everything. He's attempted appeals, petitions, all kind of legal maneuvers. He's tried the psychological stuff again, saying that he didn't understand and he was sick and this and that and the other. He also tried to marry a pen pal at one point. So this gives you an idea of how manipulative he was, even while he was in prison. The Hillside Stranglers case remains one of the most bizarre and unusual partnerships in criminal history. There have been a lot of criminal partnerships since then, but these two men, each dangerous in their own way, became significantly more lethal when together. I mean, they were not an example of one making the other go along. These were two willing, eager participants, each trying to one up the other one at how bad and how violent and how abusive they could be, not only in torturing the women, but in how and when to bring about their death. It was all about fantasy and control, domination. It was a horrible scenario. What makes this case so disturbing is not simply what they did, but how easily their personalities grew into something so much more dangerous than either man might have been alone. In fact, if they had not met up and shared those fantasies, I mean, that's another thing. You meet up with a cousin you haven't seen in a long time. Where does the conversation go from, hey man, what have you been doing lately? How's your sister? How's your mom? How's the rest of the family? To, hey, I think we ought to team up and kill people together. I've never taken anything close to that type of leap with my family members. So it's just odd to me. But LA did change policing practices because of this investigation. Interagency coordination improved and task forces became really common. Serial investigations began shifting towards centralized command instead of just individual things. So today's look at the Hillside Stranglers reminds us of something that investigators often say. One predator is dangerous. Two predators working together can be catastrophic.